up, and then down, and then up, and then down. All right, that's as much movement as I'm going to do. Up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. You know, I have always loved roller coasters. You know, we were just talking about it in Sunday school, actually. But I grew up about 45 minutes from Kings Island, and so, you know, every year we would get season passes, and we would try to go 7 or 8, maybe 9 times a year, as many times as we could. Especially when I was a teenager, you know, we had it worked out to a science. You know, my friend Aaron worked at McDonald's, and so he would, like, scour the trash can at night, and he would get those Monopoly pieces. You remember that? Some of those Monopoly pieces had free stuff on them. And so we would pay the $60 for the season pass at the beginning of the year. We would split like $2 or $3 worth of gas. You know, we would leave the park and go to McDonald's and get our free food. And so we were so poor, but we were still able to enjoy the roller coasters as much as we possibly could. And I don't know, my parents were really weird. Like, they would go to like random theme parks all across the United States, even though they really didn't like to ride rides. So, you know, I've been to, you know, Knott's Berry Farm in California, and I've been to Busch Gardens in Tampa, Florida, just weird places that just gone and been able to ride roller coasters. But there's one sensation that I chase. Like, you know, if I'm going to ride a roller coaster, there's one thing that I want. I don't want, and I don't know how much you know about coasters, but there's like G-forces that kind of push you into your seat. I'm not looking for that. There's like, you know, things that go flip you from side to side. I'm not looking for that either. I'm too old for that. You know, but there's one sensation that I absolutely love, and it's airtime. You know, when you're just going up, 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 and then it starts going back down, but your body doesn't quite go down quite as fast as the train, and so you're just float kind of out there in the middle of nowhere. That's what I like. I like that. And so, you know, Millennium Force at Cedar Point has been my favorite roller coaster for a long time because it's just got a few spots like that. There's just one that's just this nice, big, gentle hill, and you're just floating up in the air for so long. It's nice. Yeah, but then they built this new thing that's up here behind me just a couple years ago. This is called the Steel Vengeance, if you've never been there before. And they built it out of the carcass of an old, disgusting ride called the Mean Streak. So the Mean Streak was an awful ride. It was, I mean, it's just this big, wooden, ugly mess. And it was so rough. It used to go like, I think it went upwards of 60 miles per hour. They realized that they were like breaking people's necks. And so they decided to slow it down to the 40s, and it still didn't make it any better of a ride. So they spent tons and tons and tons of money on this thing. And so what's really cool is that they were able to salvage it. They were able to create something out of its remains. So there's this coaster factory or designer called Rocky Mountain Coasters. And that's what they do. They take these old wooden monstrosities that nobody will ride anymore, and they turn them into extremely cool new steel coasters. And so that's what you see up here behind me is Steel Vengeance. And it just goes up and down and up and down and up and down like a crazy fool. So airtime, it has 27 and a half seconds worth of airtime where you are floating out of your seat. That's out of a 2.5 minute ride. So you're talking about a fifth of the ride, you're not even in your seat. And it just has these creative ways where you just think you're about ready to go back down into your seat, and then it goes down even more, and you stay up in the air even longer. It's an amazing ride. Up and down and up and down. So if I say to you, hey, life is like a roller coaster, what do I mean by that? Do I mean that life is fun and exhilarating? You know, usually I mean that there is big, huge high highs, and then there are big, huge low lows. And if I say to you the Christian life is like a roller coaster, I'm also not probably saying that sometimes it's like an exhilarating ride. Sometimes I'm saying that even Christians have high highs and low lows. And that's what we're going to see. That's what we see here in our passage this morning with Paul. Paul had some high highs and he had some low lows. And so you've got these false teachers, and they're bragging and they're boasting about how great they are, and they're telling you their stories, and they've got their letters of recommendation, and they're boasting in how great they are and how many letters are after their name. And Paul comes around and he says, you know what, one time I was lowered out of a building in a fish basket because I was running away from people. That's what he chooses to boast in. He's not going to boast just in these high highs. He's also going to boast in these low lows. So we're going to see three things here. We're going to see low fish basket. We're going to see high that Paul goes into the very presence of God, and he has a vision of God's very throne room. And then we're going to see the low we call the thorn in the flesh. And we're going to try to talk about what this thorn in the flesh is, and we're going to try to see maybe you have one. I know that I have several, but these are situations that God allows into our life to keep us humble and to keep us dependent on him. Just ask the people in Sunday school, what would happen if we had a baby and we just gave that baby everything that they wanted for the entirety of their life? What kind of person would that turn out to be? We all know, right? They would turn out to be the biggest spoiled brat that you've ever met. Sometimes even difficult situations can have beneficial results. And that's what we're going to see here with the thorn in the flesh. So the whole idea of this passage, I think, is to give us perspective on the ups and downs of the Christian life, and to help us to understand that it's just not these high highs, these great spiritual experiences that make us into the Christian that God wants us to be. Sometimes it's these low lows and these times where nothing seems to be going right. Sometimes God uses those to build us into the people he wants us to be as well. All right, so here's the central truth today. God's power is shown most clearly in our weakness. God's power is shown most clearly in our weakness. So Paul's not going to get up there like he could and just say, hey, look at all these great things I've done. I've planted tens of churches all around the empire. I was converted to the faith because I literally saw Jesus face to face. He called me himself. I studied underneath the tutelage of one of the greatest rabbis in Jewish history, Rabbi Gamaliel. He could have gone on and on and on about his credentials, and he could have compared them to these false teachers and come out on top. That's the game they wanted to play. That's not the game that Paul was going to play. Paul was going to boast not just in his strengths and not just in his high points, but also in the low things that happened in his life as well, including running away from the authorities and escaping in a fish basket. So what are some things that we can learn from hardships? What are some things that we can learn from struggles? And so let's go open this back up here and see what we can see. So this end of chapter 11, it just kind of floats there. And as I was trying to figure out how to preach this, where does this go? So originally I had it in the last sermon that we did, and what's interesting about the last sermon was that Paul goes through this catalog of misery, I guess we could say, where lots of awful things happen to him, but it's almost like a heroic type of bad things, I was beaten for the Lord, and I was in prison for the Lord, and I was shipwrecked and was out on the sea for the Lord. And it's kind of got this heroic tinge to it. So even though Paul's boasting in weaknesses and sufferings, Paul still kind of sounds like he comes out on top, like he's better than the false teachers because he's willing to suffer for his faith, and they weren't. And then we get to this passage, and this goes to tell us that Paul isn't just talking about the heroic bad things that happen in life. He's talking about all the bad things that happen in life, including ones that might have been humiliating. So I tried to include it in that sermon, but it just didn't fit. And it doesn't really fit here when we're talking about the thorn in the flesh either. But it really fits in both. It doesn't quite fit in either, but it fits in both. And that's what we have here. This is kind of the climax, of the catalog of weaknesses that Paul talks about in chapter 11, but also it's a precursor to this thorn in the flesh that we see in chapter 12. And so we're going to see this really low spot, and then we're going to see this really high spot, and then we're going to go back to the low spot of the thorn in the flesh. So let's take a look at this. Look at verse 30 of chapter 11. If I must boast, I will boast about the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus, who is blessed forever, knows I'm not lying. In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to arrest me, but I was let down in a rope basket through a window in the wall of the city and escaped his hands. It was necessary to go on boasting, though it's not profitable. I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, but God knows, he was caught up into the third heaven. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I don't know, but God knows, he was caught up into paradise and heard things too sacred to be put into words, things that a person is not permitted to speak. On behalf of such an individual, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except about my weaknesses. For even if I wish to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will be telling the truth. But I refrain from this so that no one may regard me beyond what he sees in me or he hears from me. And so what I think Paul learns here is humility. And I think we too, if we look at the struggles of life properly, we too can learn humility. So, every field has rock stars, right? I mean, we know literal rock stars, right? But who respects literal rock stars? Not very many of us. Or, pop culture icons. I mean, yeah, that's nice, but do you really respect them? I don't know. But usually in your field, say you're a teacher, or say you love the Bible, studying the Bible like I do, or whether you are an engineer or whatever, usually there's somebody that you point to and you're like, man, that dude is a rock star. Not a literal rock star, but they know what they're doing. They are the top of their game. Okay, so I was just trying to think through, in the academic world, in the pastoral world, we got rock stars, I guess, like John Piper, John MacArthur, those kinds of guys. Not really interested in them. But in the academic world, we also kind of have a few rock stars. Not very many, but there are a few. And so one of them is this guy up here behind me, N.T. Wright. He's the one on the right. And he is the Bishop of Canterbury. He also teaches at Oxford and London. Absolute brilliant guy. Okay, so 2010, he was coming to America, and he was going to be speaking at the theological conference that my friends and I try to go to every couple of years. And so we were really excited. And he was going to debate John Piper. And it was going to be over the issue of justification, which was really popular back in 2010. And really, we were kind of people that didn't have a dog in the fight, I guess you could say. Because on the one hand, you had the Reformed definition of justification, which John Piper was supposed to represent. And on the other hand, you have N.T. Wright, who's his own thing. So he was trying to, he came out with a book called Justification and was kind of revolutionized the way people were starting to think about it. We kind of agree with a little bit of what N.T. Wright says, and we agree with a little bit of what the Reformed people say. So we're kind of in the middle. So it's kind of nice to just watch a debate and say, I don't really care who wins. I hope they bloody each other up. It's kind of fun. So, but this dude, he just creates that kind of aura around him like a rock star everywhere he goes. So there were 3 people that were speaking. Piper was supposed to speak, but I don't know if he got cold feet at the last minute or if he got sick or something, but he canceled. And so another scholar, Tom Schreiner, spoke in his place, and then there was a third guy. And so each of them got their own session, and then they had a debate. So I went to each of the 3 sessions, and the first 2, it was a big, huge hotel ballroom. And I would say that it was about, maybe 2/3 full, each one of them. And so when it got to N.T. Wright, I wasn't worried about getting a seat, but I guess I should have been. So I got to the ballroom 15 minutes ahead of the thing, and it was packed. There was not a seat left in the place. So what they had done is they had created 3 or 4 other rooms, other ballrooms, where they had put screens up so that they could catch the overflow. And so I ended up being in one of those rooms staring at a screen. And he did an amazing job. He's just one of those people that he could talk about, the weather outside for an hour, and you would just be like, oh, okay, this is cool. just really fun to listen to. I don't know, part of it's the accent or what, but just really fun to listen to. I don't agree with everything he says, of course, but I like to listen to him talk. So he speaks, does his thing. It's fantastic. So when the question and answer time comes in the debate, actually between each of these scholars, they had a panel of all 3 of them up there. I was like, I don't want a front row seat. So I got there an hour early and staked my spot. Because what else am I going to do in a hotel? What else am I going to do? So stuck my spot there and ready for this to happen and unfold. And sure enough, he didn't disappoint. Just this rock star aura the whole time. Just knows the Bible so well. His opponents, which are also, PhDs and scholars, they would bring up a point and he would come back at him. And by the end of him speaking, he has that way of kind of summing up what someone else believes, showing you why it's stupid and not biblical, and how could you ever believe that, but doing it with a smile on his face. It's just he just eviscerates people, but just with this, just in such a jovial way. But at the end of it, you're like, how could anybody think that? Which is not fun to debate against somebody like that, by the way. So even if he's wrong, sometimes he can just make somebody else sound wrong. So he's debating, and somebody would bring out, Schreiner would be like, well, what about Romans 7:22? And then he would just turn to it in his Greek Bible, translate it from the Greek on the fly, talk about the tense of the Greek. Just same with the Hebrew. He could go right to the Hebrew, had his Hebrew Bible up there. It's just, in the academic world, he's a rock star. In any other world, he's not. But I think he's like the C.S. Lewis of our day. So I just remember thinking at the time, maybe this is kind of silly, but man, if I were him, I'd have a big head. If I was that talented, you wouldn't be able to fit me through the door. My head would just bang on both sides. But he's really a very humble guy. And, I've seen that before with other people that are very famous or very popular or very knowledgeable or very talented, and they just are really humble people. We just talked about one last week. We talked about, the scholar Schweitzer that came over from Germany and, was helping the lady with the bags. He could have had a very big head. Not only was he at the top of his field in theology, but he was also he was also an engineer and a scientist and all sorts of other things. He's just a brilliant dude, yet also very humble and cared about other people. And here we have Paul, right? Paul has every reason to have the biggest head in the world. In fact, he gets accused of that quite a bit. He literally started the Gentile church. He wrote 13 books of the 27 books of our New Testament, which, if I do my math right, is pretty much half. He didn't write half of the New Testament, of course, but he wrote half of the books in the New Testament. That's pretty impressive. When he came to know the Lord, he had a vision of Jesus himself. Jesus himself appeared to him to lead him to the Lord. How many of us can say that? He was transported. We read here in 2 Corinthians 12 that he was transported into the very presence of God and heard things that he wasn't even allowed to speak. He was studied under Gamaliel, like we just talked about a little bit ago. He knew the Old Testament from front to back. He was a brilliant debater. There's all sorts of reasons that Paul should have been marked by pride and arrogance, but instead he was able to stay humble. So why was he able to stay humble? And I think we see that here in this passage, is that the Lord gave him a thorn in the flesh. So he could have boasted about all these great things, but instead he boasted in the fish basket and his thorn. He did talk about his time that he spent in the very presence of God, but even then he talks about it in the third person, just to kind of distance itself a little bit from himself, even though it was his experience here. So let's talk about this roller coaster that Paul had here. The first one is the fish basket. So what happened? And this happened during Paul's silent period. So we know in Acts chapter 9 that Jesus calls Paul and he comes to know the Lord, right? And then we know that eventually he starts planting churches and he starts being involved in the book of Acts. But there's kind of a long period of time there we call the silent period, where we don't hear much of what Paul is doing. Doesn't mean he's not doing something. Luke tells us that he was one of the first things he did after he got saved is he went into the synagogues of Damascus and he began to debate with the Jews there about the identity of the Messiah. So trying to tell them that the Messiah is Jesus. So we know that he got right to work, but we also just have this kind of period of time where we don't really know what he was up to. But one of the things that happened during that silent period we have listed here, and that is that the people in Damascus, which were the Nabateans at the time and King Aretas, for some reason they got disgruntled with Paul. And maybe he was stirring up the Jewish people. They didn't like him. They wanted him to be gone. They went to their governor and said, hey, you got to do something about this guy. He's just causing all sorts of trouble. So anyway, Paul's able to find out that they're about ready to go get him. And we learn in the book of Acts chapter 9, that every single gate to the city was guarded by the police. Okay, so he's inside of a walled city, so like this. And there's two doors here. And so both doors, have cops at them that are ready to arrest him, put him in prison, and who knows what else. So how is Paul going to get out of this situation? Well, one of his disciples has a great idea. I live in the wall, maybe, and I have a window that goes outside. Maybe, I know it's like 3 stories high, but we can lower you down with ropes and a basket. And so Paul is, first of all, running away. And second of all, he runs away and a fish basket. And a fish basket is just what you would think. When you go fishing, we don't use baskets. We use buckets now, right? So that the fish can stay alive for a little while until we kill them at the right time. But in ancient world, a lot of times they would just, they didn't have like sealed containers like we do, so they just put them in a basket. So just think about how disgusting your bucket gets. Think about how disgusting this basket would be. Okay, there's not really a way to clean it. It just would smell like fish guts. That's what Paul gets put into. He gets put into this basket and lowered down. I have to imagine that it might be a little bit humiliating for someone of Paul's stature to be lowered out of the wall, running away from the authorities in a fish basket. Not as heroic as being beaten by rods in the middle of town. Not as heroic as being shipwrecked. These things you can talk about in glorious terms. Yeah, I got lowered out of a wall in a fish basket is kind of a humiliating experience. But Paul tells us that anyway to show us that there's these low lows. I was just thinking about, we were at Orlando Universal the other day, and they have this motorbike ride. So, you got one person that's riding the motorbike, and then you got someone else in the sidecar. And so Sarah got to ride the motorbike, and I was sitting in the sidecar looking up at her like this. And I remember thinking in my head, this is kind of humiliating. I don't know who rides in sidecars, but I don't want to be one of them. Right? And I think that must have been how Paul felt about this particular situation. Yet he glories in it. He boasts about it because he's going to boast in the low points of life, because that's where God's power shines the most. So we've got this really low, right? This humiliating low. Then we got this high that we read about here. And he says, there's this man that I know who 14 years ago, he was caught up into the third heaven, and he was able to see God and speak with him. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. Only God knows that. Okay, so who are we talking about here? Well, as we go through the story, Paul begins to use the word I as we get later on. And so we know that Paul is talking about himself. And so this also would have happened during Paul's silent years. He would have been, we don't know exactly what was going on, but apparently he had this vision where he was caught up into the third heaven. So where is the third heaven? So this is simple, even though there's no scripture passage that I can point to say, well, this is how the Jewish people looked at heaven. We know from other books that were written by Jewish people of the same time period how they did. Okay, so the first heaven is simply the sky. So their word for heaven is the same word as their word for sky. So just where the clouds are at, where rain happens, that's the first heaven. The second heaven would have been space. So the places where there are planets and stars, the sun, the moon, that would have been the second heaven. And so the third heaven is the heaven that we normally think about, the very presence of God, where God dwells. And so when Paul here is transported into the third heaven, he is transported into the very presence of God. And so this is a pretty amazing experience. I mean, you can't really beat that, can you? And Paul doesn't know whether it's in the body or out of the body. So what does that mean? Well, simple, right? I mean, if he doesn't know. I mean, was his whole body taken up into the third heaven? Or was he simply having a vision and his mind traveled there and his spirit traveled there, but his body remained here? He doesn't know, which makes me think while he was there that he felt like he had his body, that he felt like he was whole, but he wasn't sure of that at all. Whatever it is, he was transported into the very presence of God, and God spoke to him and told him things that he couldn't utter in our language even if he wanted to. And even if he wanted to, he couldn't do it because God told him not to. So this is the kind of situation that I think would lead to a pretty big head. I mean, if God himself pulls you off of the earth and takes you into his very presence and has a conversation with you one-on-one, that's a big deal. Right? So Paul could have brought that out when he's like arguing about credentials with these false teachers. You don't know where I've been. I have been in the very presence of God. Have you been there? I don't think so. Have these guys been there? No, you need to listen to me and stop listening to them. But that isn't what Paul does here with this story. He talks about this high in his life, but sandwiched between talking about two lows in his life to give us this balanced picture of the Christian life is going to consist of highs and it's going to consist of lows. And we need to have the proper perspective on both of these in order to live a well-balanced Christian life. So let's talk about Joshua here for a second. So Joshua, the early part of the book, Joshua is going to conquer the promised land, and God tells him that he's going to be with him and he's going to be the power to help him to win the battles. And so they walk across the Jordan River as if on dry ground, and then we've got this entire huge walled city of Jericho, and impenetrable, or at least very hard to penetrate. And what happens? They just walk around one time for 7 days, and on the seventh day, God tells them to walk around 7 times, to blow their horns. The walls come down, and then they're able to win this huge military victory, this huge battle. That also has the propensity to go to one's head, right? Joshua was this big-time general. He just won this big-time battle. So what are 2 ways that he could have looked back on that situation? He could have looked back on that and said, well, wait a second. If God wasn't there, the walls would still be up, and I would never have won this victory. Or he could have looked at it and said, wow, look what I did. I'm a pretty good general. Okay, so which one did he do? That's the question. Well, he did the second. So he knew and was relying on God all the way up until the victory. And then in hindsight, he looked back at the victory and he said, wow, look what I did. And so the very next battle that they were going to have was a small town of Ai. So just think about it this way. He took over Fort Wayne. Now he's going for Busco. Okay? If you had just taken over Fort Wayne, you'd be like, Busco? I can do this in my sleep. Right? Those people. Right? There's no way they can stand against me. And that's exactly what Joshua thought. So he did not go to the Lord. He did not ask for his advice. He did not say, God, do you want me to do this? He did not say, God, what's your plan? Instead, he just took some troops and he went ahead and tried to take over the city of Ai. And it failed miserably in a humiliating fashion. So finally, after this loss, then he goes back to the Lord. What happened? And he says, well, you should have asked me. If you had asked me, I would have told you that there was sin in the camp and that you had to deal with a guy by the name of Achan and his family in order to have success at Ai. But you didn't contact me. You thought that you were the guy that could win this battle all on your own, and so you failed. And so we see this high in the life of Joshua, and we see this very low that happens next. And it was in service of teaching Joshua a lesson. Okay? You must rely on the Lord. It doesn't matter what kind of mountaintop experience that you had in your life, there's going to be another low, and you need to be able to put your trust in God. So Hezekiah then becomes kind of like the opposite of that. You know, when Hezekiah, Jerusalem is surrounded, when he was king, there's hundreds of thousands of Assyrian troops on the outside of the city. And so what does Hezekiah do? Does Hezekiah go and blow the trumpet and call the troops up and say, hey, let's get up on those walls and let's make sure we got a bunch of arrows and let's let these guys have it? No, the first thing that Hezekiah does is he goes to the temple of God and he prays. And he says to God, I can't beat these guys. I can't do this on my own. I can only do it with your help. And so God says, okay. And so then we see the angel of death come through in the middle of the night and kill, over 100,000 Assyrian soldiers. The rest of them wake up and see, oh, my people are dead, and they run away. And so because Hezekiah trusted in God, he was able to win the big victory. Because he knew he couldn't do it on his own and only the Lord could do it, he was able to find success. And so what we can learn, if we have the right perspective, what we can learn from the lows of life is humility, is that we can't do it on our own, that we need to do it with the help of the Lord. Second thing that Paul, I think, learns here, in addition to humility, is also how to depend on God in these types of situations. So let's look at verse 7 through verse 9. Even because of the extraordinary character of the revelations, therefore, so that I would not become arrogant, after this big, huge, great thing that happened, right? I was given a thorn in the flesh. By who? By God, right? So that I would not be arrogant. Who doesn't want Paul to become arrogant? Not Satan, it's God. So he's given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan sent to trouble me, so that I would not become arrogant. I asked the Lord 3 times about this, that it would depart from me, but he said to me, my grace is enough for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. So then I will boast most gladly about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may be seen in me. Okay, so I think he also learns here that he needs to depend on the Lord, and I think that's what God was trying to teach him. All right, so I didn't want to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Might as well talk about one of my own thorns, right? All right, maybe this will help jog your memory so you can think about one of yours in your life. And I don't just have one, I have many. But here's one that relates specifically to the act of preaching. Okay, so I started preaching when I was 14 years old. My youth leader, I don't know if he just wanted Wednesday nights off every once in a while, but he said, hey, will you speak every now and then? So I said, sure. So I remember my first sermon was on John chapter 21, and I thought it would take me a half hour. It ended up taking me 9 minutes. I remember just making jokes for the last 10, 20 minutes, just trying to pass the time because I was done. I was out of material. And so the next time I preached, I was like, well, I'm not going to go 9 minutes. I'm going to make sure. And so I ended up speaking for 70 minutes, which is not good either. So eventually, I was able to fine-tune it and get it down to where I needed it to be. So I preached, a few times in youth group. I, did a Bible study at the high school. And so after school, we would meet, once a month, I think, and I would preach a sermon, usually like 30 minutes, and then we would sit down, eat pizza, and talk about it. And I also part of competition. When I was younger, it was called the Preacher Boy competition, and then, as I got older, they changed the name to Team Challenge. But you would compete against local churches, and then, the top couple people would go and speak nationally and compete. So one year I did really good, the other year I did really awful. And that's just because I didn't know pastors. Now that I know pastors, I could game them every time that I wanted to. But I did a lot of speaking. When I got into college and seminary, I didn't do quite as much. I did do it every once in a while. And then, of course, I got the job here in 2003, so that's been 18 years ago. And I started preaching every Sunday. And I was never once nervous. Never got nervous. Like maybe like the 3 or 4 seconds before I would go up, my leg would start to jump a little bit. I get a little bit nervous, but public speaking was not something that ever made me nervous. Okay. I used to just take one piece of paper. I didn't even really use computers. I would just as I was doing my research, I would write down an outline, and then I'd write down a couple things I wanted to say about each point and like an illustration, just like a one word to jog my memory about what story I wanted to tell. And then I'd get up and I'd preach with that. Okay? Which is a bad idea because that's how you get 10 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour and a half. There's no consistency at all. All right. So anyway, fine. All the way up until Palm Sunday, 2005. So I've been a pastor for 2 years. And so I got up to preach, and I remember what I was preaching. I was preaching on the triumphal entry because Palm Sunday, right? And so I began to speak, and I was talking about mousetraps, I think, or something like that. And got about 7 or 8 minutes into the sermon, and then just started to kind of get lightheaded. I started to not be able to breathe very well, and because of that, I started to lose my train of thought. I didn't know where I was in the sermon, and so I looked down at my notes, and they're written in my handwriting, which is awful, and so I wasn't able to tell what it was being said or where I was supposed to go, and so the panic increased even more. Blank mind, can't breathe, lightheaded, and I had no idea how to get myself out of the situation. So eventually I just stopped preaching, and I said, hey, can somebody bring me up a chair? So there's a few people that were here that were there at that point. So somebody brought me up a chair, and I sat down, and Joanne, she went and got me a glass of water and brought it out to me, because that's what Joanne does. And so I sat there for about 3 minutes, and I got composure, and then I got back up and finished the sermon. But I have never forgotten that, ever. I know exactly what that day felt like. I know exactly what that moment felt like. And every time now that I get up to preach, I remember it. Okay? Usually it happens after I'm preaching for about 3 or 4 minutes, like right around the time where the central truth comes up. You might say, Aaron, I think that's 12 or 15 minutes, but okay. But I remember that day. I remember, am I going to go blank again? Am I going to forget what I'm doing and be embarrassed again? Am I going to be humiliated? And I don't know what it caused it. I mean, I have 2 theories. One theory is that at the time, I was making some major decisions that some people in the church did not like. And so sometimes I would get up front and people would be staring daggers at me. And so I think maybe I would have panicked because of that. Maybe it was a panic attack. The second thing is I also had very severe untreated asthma at that point. And so it was also in April. And, that's when those flowering trees come out, and that's one of my biggest triggers. So it could have simply been an asthma attack. Whatever it was, it changed how I did everything. I started to script my sermons. And the reason why was if, I ever find myself in that spot, I can just look down and start reading. So that's how it started. The people that see my script back there, they know I don't follow it ever. So now it's just kind of for, if I do have a problem, I guess it's there. But normally it's just for posterity's sake that, I just have it forever. So it doesn't take me that much longer to script it, so why not? So to me, it's kind of a thorn in the flesh when it comes to preaching. I never, ever, ever get up in front of people and think, I've got this. This is easy. There's no problem. I did back when I was younger, but I don't anymore. Every time I get done, I'm grateful that I was able to make it through and that I was able to get God's message across. And so I think it's one of those things that God brought into my life for a reason, to keep me humble and to keep me dependent on him for his strength when we do his work. So Paul had this high, right, with this, this going into the very presence of God. And so what God does is he brings in this really low into his life to keep him humble. In Greek, it's called a scallops. Not kind of like scallops, but not quite, right? And it's not a pleasant. I mean, when I think of a thorn, I think of a rose thorn. But, I mean, this is like a stake. This is like, the thing that they might have put in Jesus' side. I mean, it's like the thorns that went into his skull that are like really long. I mean, this isn't like a nice little everyday thorn that you'll get when you're like kind of rummaging through the woods or something. This is a pretty big deal. And interesting thing, it was given to him by God, and it was also a messenger of Satan. Okay, so this is kind of a strange thought. This is what we've been talking about in Sunday school for the past couple of weeks, is who's responsible for this thorn? Did God send this thorn into Paul's life, or did Satan send this thorn into Paul's life? And you know what the answer to that is? Yes. It's both. And so sometimes I think, we try to get God completely off the hook for any kind of suffering that we have in our life. And we have to admit, first of all, that there would be no suffering in this life if we hadn't made bad choices. Sin and evil, all of those are a result of the choice that Adam and Eve make, and then we continue to make the same choice they did every day of our lives. Okay, so evil wouldn't be in the world if it weren't for us. But I think that God is able to use evil and suffering in our life for good ends. He's able to turn lemons into lemonade, I guess is a good way to think about it. So Satan's involved in this, but God is involved in this thorn. And I think that each one has a different outcome that they're looking for. So when the thorn comes into our life, what does God want it to do? God wants it to keep us humble. God wants it to keep us dependent on him rather than arrogant with these huge heads that can't fit through doors. Satan wants to destroy you. He wants to devour you. He wants to derail your faith. So who are we going to let win, then, comes the question. Are we going to have the proper perspective when the hard times come into our life? Are we going to allow them into our heart and our mind to help us to grow and to become stronger and more humble and more dependent on God? Or are we going to let them destroy our faith? And that happens. It happens to a lot of people where, God, or they have tough times in their life and they think, well, God can't be great or God can't be good because he's let these things into my life. And so they walk away. But Paul is saying we need to have the proper perspective on these lows in life so that we can grow from them. And it reminds me of the situation with Job, where Satan and God are kind of arguing about Job, and then God allows Job to be tested by Satan. And the idea is, will he stay true to the Lord or not? And Job had that free will choice to decide whether he was going to allow that situation to draw him closer to the Lord, or he was going to allow that situation to destroy his faith. So whether or not it's beneficial in your life when you have these thorns is up to you. How are you going to respond to it? What kind of perspective are you going to bring to it? And so he pleads with God here on 3 different occasions. I don't want this scallops. I don't want this thorn. Take it away from me. Give it to somebody else. But each time God says what? No. Okay? That's hard to hear. Sometimes we're like 2-year-olds. We want to touch the thing and no. Well, why not? Don't touch. No. Can I have this toy? No. So sometimes we're like that. We're like, I want this. I want it now. And sometimes God says no. When you pray, even about a situation that is awful and terrible in your life and you just want it to go away, sometimes you ask God to take it away and he might say no. And that's hard to hear. Why is he saying no? Well, God is allowing it to remain in our life for a reason. We see those reasons here for Paul, to keep him dependent on God, to keep him humble, to keep him having a proper perspective, to keep him from being arrogant. And the same things might be true for us, and maybe a whole host of other reasons that are unique to us. But God tells Paul this very simply, that his grace is sufficient to get through any kind of struggle that we might face. In fact, God's power is seen most clearly in our lives when we are weak and when we are dependent, because then it isn't all about us, it's about God. That's why Paul will not boast in his successes and his revelations and these great things that happened to him unless he also boasts in the fish baskets and in the thorns of life as well. So here comes a question that you're probably wondering, so we have to address it, is what is the thorn in the flesh? What was Paul's thorn in the flesh? And if you read commentaries, you could probably find I bet 120 different viewpoints if you wanted to. Okay, but I think as you scour them, you'll see that they fall into three families. Okay, so family number one, we would say, are physical issues. And so, well, we don't know what it is. He doesn't tell us. So how are you supposed to know? The only way you can do it is look throughout his other writings and think, is there some other kind of issue that we can see that he talks about somewhere else? And so we know that he talks about not being able to see very well. So some people say, well, maybe he can't see very well. I think he talks at one point about having stomach issues. So maybe there's, stomach issues that he's talking about here. So there's one where, he talks about how he can't speak very well, or he's not as eloquent as other people. So some people say maybe he has a speech impediment. So all sorts of different physical things that people bring up. And so we could call that family number one, a physical issue. And some of us have that kind of thorn in our life, whether that be a cancer diagnosis or whether that be a chronic health issue that doesn't seem to go away. There's a lot of us that have physical thorns that have come into our lives. The second one is it could be a relational issue. Maybe he's not getting along with somebody in his life. And we see that in Paul's life several times. We know that he's not getting along with the Corinthian church, apparently. We know that there was this one particular gentleman at the Corinthian church that he really didn't get along with, that we keep talking about here in 2 Corinthians. We know that he had a sharp disagreement with Barnabas. We know that he had a disagreement with Peter in Galatians chapter 2. We read about that. And those are just the ones we know about. Perhaps there are all sorts of relational issues that Paul could have had that we don't know about. And so we could probably sympathize with that too. We've probably all been in a situation where, we've had a relational issue, whether that's a marriage problem, a problem with a kid, a problem with a parent, a problem with a coworker, where things just weren't clicking like they're supposed to be clicking. And it becomes a thorn in your side. It becomes a problem that you don't really want to deal with anymore. You want it to just be done with. And the last group or the last family is spiritual issues. So most of these have to do with some sort of sin issue. Paul talks in Romans 7 about why do I always do the things I don't want to do? And so we know that Paul was just normal like all of us and, doesn't want to sin, but sometimes sins anyway. And that can be a thorn in the side as well. It could be any one of these. It could be something different. That's maybe the genius of this, that if Paul had told us what his exact thorn in the flesh was, maybe we wouldn't be able to see ours because we'd be thinking too much about his. And so knowing that it's kind of nebulous, now we get to sit there and think about, well, are there things in my life that are like this? Does God maybe have put something in my life to keep me humble and to keep me dependent on him? And we're able to see those a little bit more clearly. So it's kind of difficult. It's difficult to pray to God to have a difficult situation removed and then God to say no. And that can be a faith-shaking thing for a lot of people. But just think about that fat baby that's never had any trouble in his life and how spoiled he'll become. We don't want to be that. There's going to be some tough times, but those tough times can help us to grow into the people that God wants us to be. It's like strength training. People that go to the gym, like Don or John, that they don't go there and then just lift 0 pounds. They're not going to get strong that way. They lift multiple pounds, right? They want resistance because it's the resistance that builds the muscles. And it's the same thing in life. A lot of times it's the pain in life, it's the suffering, it's the resistance in life that ends up making us the strongest. As long as we react properly. Because you have a choice. When the suffering of life comes, you and we have the choice of how we're going to respond to it. Are we going to let Satan devour us, or are we going to let the situation cause us to be more godly and more dependent on the Lord? How are we going to respond? What kind of perspective are we going to have? I read this story from this pastor, and he was talking about his 4-year-old daughter. One day he had to bring her into the office, and she got into his office, and she was like, "This is unacceptable." I don't know if she knew the word unacceptable, but this isn't the way it's supposed to be. We need to move the furniture around. So she's bookcase needs to be over here, and the desk needs to be over there. And so he humored her, because, she's at work with him. So they start to push the desk, across the office, and she's pushing down below, and he's kind of pushing around up above. And about halfway through, he just stops pushing. And so she's sitting there, and she's huffing, and she's puffing, and she's trying to push this desk all by herself, and it isn't going anywhere. And so what does she do? She turns to her dad, and she says, "You need to step back a little bit. You're getting in my way." Was that the problem? No, the problem was that the dad was helping her push, and now he wasn't. So what should she have said? "Dad, Can you help me push? Can you help me? Simple as that. I can't do this on my own, but I know that you can. And that's the same thing with us. Sometimes we're pushing in life, and we're trying to make progress, and God's there, and then all of a sudden God might stop. And we're pushing on our own. What does God want us to do? He wants us to turn back and say, hey, where'd your push go? He wants us to be dependent on him. He wants us to be humble. And this is where American culture just literally kills us. Because American culture is all about independence. It's all about going it alone. It's all about, the Lord helps those who help themselves. No, the Lord helps those who ask him for help. So we need to learn to be humble. We need to learn to be dependent on the Lord. And so those are two things I think Paul learns here. He learns humility through the thorn. He learns, depend on God with the thorn. And he also is able to find out what true strength is. So look at the last verse. Therefore, I'm content with weaknesses, with insults, with troubles and persecutions and difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, it is then that I am strong. Real strength. So not only do the thorns of life keep us humble, but they shine a light on the source of where true strength comes from, and that's from God. So I don't know if you remember this scene from the Santa Claus. Okay, so the Santa Claus is a Christmas staple. If you haven't watched it, watch it this Christmas, right? Okay, so there's an interesting scene about halfway through the movie where we learn that this guy, so Tim Allen's character is Scott Calvin, and he's the Santa Claus. And he has an ex-wife, and this is the ex-wife's new husband. Okay, so the ex-wife and the ex-wife's new husband, they have this conversation about how they lost their faith in Santa Claus. So the wife talks about how, she really wanted this special doll, and she wrote to Santa Claus, every day for a year, get me this doll. And then Christmas rolls around, no doll. And so what's that reaction? Santa must not exist. I no longer believe in Santa. She lost her faith. So this guy tells a similar story about his weenie whistle. He wanted an Oscar Mayer weenie whistle. It's like, come on, parents, you couldn't get the guy a whistle? Anyway. So he asked Santa over and over again for a weenie whistle. He went to the mall and sat down on Santa's lap and asked him for a weenie whistle and didn't get one. And so he lost his faith in Santa. And too often I think this happens because Christians don't have a right perspective on trouble. They don't understand what Paul's trying to say here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And so when the tough time comes, they think God surely can't want a tough time in my life. And so they pray for God to take it away, and God does not take it away, and so their faith is destroyed and shipwrecked. And that's exactly what Satan wanted to happen. Satan wanted it to be destroyed. And so we need to be careful. We need to understand that we need the proper perspective on the trials of life. We need to remember that we have help to push that desk around, and that is the Lord. So when we are weak, that's when we're able to call on the strength of God. Because of one simple, inescapable truth, it is when we are weak that God is the strongest. It's when we acknowledge our weakness that we're really able to draw on the strength of God. So Ted Turner, if you're not very old, maybe you don't remember Ted Turner, but he was a television mogul. TNT is, the Turner Network. And he was very vocal about being anti-Christian in the 80s and the 90s. Kind of a big cultural icon for that. Like, he was known for being a big atheist. Well, you might be strange to find out, his dad was actually a pastor. He grew up in the church, and as a kid, he really wanted to be a missionary. And when he got to his teen years, his sister got really, really sick. And so he talks about how he prayed over and over and over again for his sister to be made well. And his sister was never made well. She ended up dying. And at that point, done. He lost his faith. Not only did he lose his faith, but then he became an outspoken critic of Christianity because he didn't have the right perspective. He allowed the thorn to consume him rather than to make him stronger. We're going to have thorns in our life. We're going to have physical issues. We're going to have relational issues. We're going to have spiritual issues. It's just going to happen because we live in a broken world until the Lord comes and sets everything right completely. But God can use these situations in our life to draw us closer to him and to help us to understand that we need him and him alone, because it's in our weakness that he is strong. Just like James says in James chapter 1, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you face trials of many kinds. Wait, say that again? Consider it joy when you experience trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And let perseverance finish its work, so that you may become mature and complete, not lacking anything. So if Paul's going to boast, he's going to boast on his trials and his weaknesses, because that's when he is the strongest. It's when we are weak and we are humble and relying on God's enabling power, it's in those circumstances that we get to see the strength of Christ come through. Let's pray. Dear Lord, again, we just thank you so much for this passage of Scripture. I mean, it's good to know that somebody as great as Paul and as successful as Paul was able to have this kind of perspective on the lows of life. And so we just pray that we're able to imitate that, whether that's a relational issue that people are dealing with today, whether that's a spiritual or a sin issue that just won't seem to go away.